Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let yourself relax as we journey back to the frozen north. Tonight, we'll uncover how the Vikings, without electricity, heaters, or modern comfort, mastered survival, building warm longhouses, layering furs, and even sleeping with animals to endure the coldest nights. Imagine stepping outside on a night so bitterly cold that your breath crystallizes in the air, drifting upward in little white clouds that shimmer for just a second before vanishing into the black sky. The kind of night where your eyelashes clump together with frost, where your fingertips turn stiff before you even finish pulling your cloak tighter, where the wind slices through every layer of fabric as if you were naked in its path. You take one step into the snow, and your toes already feel like stones, hard and numb, threatening to snap off if you linger. Now imagine walking back inside your home, reaching for the log pile near the fire pit, only to find it empty. No cozy fireplace to throw sparks into, no backup bundle of dry birch, no electric heater humming in the corner, no soft fleece blanket to cocoon yourself with, just the dark, the cold, and the sound of snow piling against your door with relentless weight. For you, that's a nightmare scenario. For the Vikings, it was life. The people of the North didn't dream about running out of firewood. They woke up to that reality night after night, winter after winter. In a world where temperatures could drop to -30 degrees Celsius, where the wind howled like a pack of wolves hunting across the fjords, where the snow came not in inches, but in walls that buried entire villages, the idea of running out of firewood wasn't just inconvenient, it could mean death. Yet somehow, they survived. Not just survived, but endured, thrived, and even built an empire that stretched across oceans. The real miracle of Viking life wasn't just the ships they carved or the battles they fought. It was the fact that in the coldest, darkest nights, when modern people would have frozen solid without central heating, they found ways to live. We think of warmth today as a guarantee. A thermostat turns, and the room glows cozy in minutes. A heated blanket plugs into the wall, humming with artificial comfort. The Vikings had none of that. No electricity, no insulation foam, no double-paned windows humming with trapped heat. Their survival was raw, carved from necessity, and crafted with ingenuity. Firewood, the one resource we associate with winter, was a luxury they couldn't always afford. In many regions of Scandinavia, especially the far north, trees were scarce, thin, stunted, or buried under deep snow. Winters lasted half the year. If a Viking family had relied only on wood to stay alive, they wouldn't have lasted long enough to see spring. So instead, they turned cold into an adversary they could outsmart. They reshaped their homes, their habits, even their very diets into survival tools. Picture the longhouse on a night like this. From the outside, it doesn't look like much. A heavy wooden frame, thick walls, a roof buried under sod. Snow presses against the sides, the sky is starless, and smoke seeps lazily from a small hole in the roof. Step inside, and the world changes. It is not warm by modern standards. You won't find cozy armchairs and glowing fireplaces, but it is alive. The fire at the center smolders low, smoke drifting and swirling toward the rafters. Benches line the walls, where family members huddle beneath layers of hides and wool, pressed shoulder to shoulder, and there, only a few feet away, are the animals, cows, sheep, goats, all breathing, shifting, radiating heat into the same shared space. The air smells of smoke and hay, fur and sweat, but it is survivable. The contrast is sharp. Outside, a man could freeze to death in minutes. Inside, life lingers, stubborn and strong, against the storm. For us, the thought of sleeping with animals in the same room seems primitive, even unthinkable. But to the Vikings, it was strategy. They understood, in a way we've forgotten, that every living body is a source of heat. A cow can give off as much warmth as a space heater. Sheep are walking radiators draped in wool. Even dogs curled at the foot of a bed weren't just companions, they were survival tools. Imagine lying down on your bench, your children pressed close, a cow shifting gently in the stall nearby, the heat from its massive body seeping upward to mingle with your own. Imagine drifting to sleep, smoke stinging your eyes, but warmth holding the cold at bay. That was Viking life. Not glamorous, not romantic, but brilliantly practical. And the fire itself? It wasn't the roaring, cinematic blaze you might picture in a mead hall painting. They didn't want bright flames crackling high into the rafters. That would waste precious fuel. Instead, the Viking fire was low, steady, smouldering. Logs, when available, were coaxed to last as long as possible. Peat bricks, animal dung, and dried scraps of brush were pressed into service when trees failed them. Even glowing stones pulled from the pit were turned into ancient hot water bottles, wrapped in fur and tucked under bedding to radiate warmth all night long. The fire wasn't the centerpiece. It was one part of a larger system, a careful balance of architecture, biology, and human resilience. Think for a moment about what it means to sleep in that world. Not sleep as we know it, under memory foam and down comforters, but sleep as a survival act. The Vikings didn't crawl into bed expecting comfort. They dressed for war against the cold, wool tunics, fur cloaks, linen undergarments, seal skin boots stuffed with moss. They climbed into raised wooden platforms, curtained off with hides, trapping their own heat like little pods. Families slept together, pressing close, transforming into a living furnace. Beneath them, straw and bark shielded them from the frozen ground. Above them, smoke hung in the rafters, a blanket of warmth held just below the roof. Every detail was intentional. Every choice meant the difference between life and death. Now imagine waking in that world. The storm has raged all night. Outside, snowdrifts tower against the door. Ice crystals clatter against the walls like broken glass in the wind. But inside, you are alive. Not comfortable, not luxurious, but alive. Your body still radiates the heat of the fat, rich stew you ate before bed. The blubber and broth still burning slow in your stomach like fuel. Your skin still carries the warmth of your neighbor's body, pressed against yours. Your lungs are full of smoky, heavy air, but they are breathing, steady. You survived the night, not because you threw another log on the fire, but because you lived in a system designed to outwit the cold. This was the Viking miracle. They turned survival into strategy. They didn't fight the cold with fire alone. They fought it with animals, with architecture, with clothing, with food, with family, with every scrap of knowledge they possessed. For them, the nightmare of running out of firewood wasn't a nightmare at all. It was reality. But reality didn't kill them. It shaped them into some of the toughest people in history. When you picture them setting sail into icy seas, raiding across Europe, or carving farms out of frozen soil, remember this. Their greatest victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the long, dark nights of winter when the firewood ran out and the cold tried to win. Night after night, they proved it couldn't. The first thing most people imagine when they think of surviving a freezing winter is firewood. The crackle of burning logs, the golden light filling a room, the comfort of knowing that as long as you have a steady pile of wood, you can keep the cold at bay. It is such a natural assumption for us today that it feels almost universal, almost timeless. But the Vikings lived in a part of the world where that assumption broke down. For them, firewood was not guaranteed, not abundant, and not always an option. In fact, firewood was one of the scarcest and most unreliable resources in the North, and its absence shaped Viking life in ways most people never think about. Picture the geography of Scandinavia. Jagged fjords cut deep into the land like scars, cliffs rising straight out of the icy sea, and long valleys carved by glaciers that never truly let go of their chill. In the south, there were forests, dark, brooding, and thick with pine and birch. But move farther north, and the trees became fewer, shorter, and more twisted by the wind. Winters stretched not for weeks, but for months, sometimes more than half the year. Snow piled so deep that even tall spruces bent beneath its weight. The ground stayed frozen long into the spring, and ice often returned before the crops had fully ripened in autumn. In this harsh world, firewood was a luxury, not a certainty. Families who relied only on wood would quickly find themselves facing an empty pile long before the season ended. Even in forested areas, the problem wasn't as simple as cutting down trees whenever you wanted. Wood had to be dried before it burned properly. Fresh logs, heavy with sap and moisture, hissed and smoked more than they gave heat. That meant Viking families had to plan far in advance, cutting trees in summer and leaving them to season for months. But summer was short and precious. Every able hand was needed to farm, fish, repair ships, or store food. Time spent cutting and hauling timber was time stolen from survival in other forms. And there was always the danger of over-harvesting. Cut too many trees, and the land itself became weaker, more prone to erosion, less able to provide shelter from the winds. Firewood, for all its importance, could not be the only answer. Now imagine a family in the far north. Outside, the landscape is a frozen tundra, stretching as far as the eye can see. The only trees are stunted birches, their branches twisted and skeletal. The people living here did not have the luxury of great forests. They had shrubs, scrubby growth, and whatever driftwood washed ashore from the sea. Driftwood became precious treasure. When storms lashed the coast, families combed the beaches, gathering every twisted log and branch tossed up by the waves. Some pieces had floated for weeks across the North Atlantic, carried by currents from faraway lands. To the Vikings, these were gifts of survival. But driftwood was unpredictable, scattered, and salty from the ocean, burning poorly unless dried. You could not build an entire winter strategy on driftwood alone. The scarcity of wood forced the Vikings to look elsewhere, to use their ingenuity in ways that might seem unthinkable today. They turned to peat, cutting blocks of it from marshes and drying them for fuel. They used animal dung, dried into hard cakes, as a substitute for logs. They scavenged brush and branches, anything that could smolder long enough to keep a fire alive. To us, these sound like desperate measures. To them, it was normal life. When you live in a land where winters can outlast your food supplies, you cannot afford to rely on one resource. You diversify, you improvise, and you build systems that make the most of everything around you. But beyond the physical scarcity of trees, there was the deeper challenge of logistics. Even when forests were available, cutting and hauling timber in winter was dangerous, exhausting work. Imagine trudging through waist-deep snow with an axe, your breath freezing against your beard, your hands stiff inside wool mittens. Felling a tree in such conditions took time and strength that were already stretched thin by hunger and cold. Then came the task of dragging heavy logs back across icy ground to the longhouse, a task that could take hours for just a few pieces of wood. Each journey risked frostbite, injury, or worse. And in the deep dark of a Viking winter, when daylight lasted only a few hours, every wasted moment carried a heavy price. This harsh reality is why the romantic image of Vikings clustered around a roaring fire in a massive hall is misleading. Yes, fires burned, but they were small, controlled, and designed for efficiency rather than spectacle. A bright blaze might look impressive, but it devoured fuel at a pace no family could sustain. The smarter choice was a slow, steady smolder that gave heat without waste. This difference in approach tells us something crucial about Viking culture. They were not reckless with their resources. They understood limits, respected them, and built their survival strategies around careful balance. The winters themselves were long enough to stretch memory. Imagine a child born in late autumn. By the time that child took their first steps, winter was still holding the land in its grip. Snowstorms howled so often that families lost track of how many had passed. The sun might rise for only a few hours each day, and sometimes not at all. Days blended into nights, nights into weeks, and weeks into months of cold. The idea of firewood as a consistent solution became laughable. No pile of logs, no matter how carefully stacked, could last that long. So the Vikings adapted, not only in what they burned, but in how they thought about warmth. Instead of treating firewood as the central pillar of survival, they turned it into one element of a larger system. Architecture, clothing, animals, food, and social habits all became forms of heat management. A fire might start the process, but the true victory came from what happened after the flames dimmed. The house trapped the warmth. The straw and hides shielded bodies from frozen earth. The animals added their heat. The people layered their clothes and pressed together in shared space. The firewood, scarce and precious, became part of a symphony of survival rather than the whole song. When we think of Viking toughness, we often picture warriors with axes, braving storms at sea. But their real toughness was quieter, more domestic, born from the ability to live in a world where even the simplest resource, wood for a fire, was never certain. Their resilience came from turning scarcity into strength, from transforming a land that seemed unlivable into one of the most influential cultures of its age. So the next time you hear the word Viking, don't just imagine ships slicing across the North Sea or horned helmets that never actually existed. Imagine instead a dark winter night, a family huddled inside a longhouse, a low fire smouldering with whatever fuel they could find. Outside, the snow piles higher and the wind scream, but inside, the people endure. They endure not because they had endless firewood, but because they learned how to survive without it. That, more than anything else, is what made them extraordinary. Imagine a world where the walls of your home decide whether you live or die. For the Vikings, that was not a metaphor, it was reality. When the nights stretched endlessly through the Nordic winter, when blizzards screamed like banshees across the fjords and snow buried villages in silence, survival depended on more than just bravery or strength. It depended on the structure you returned to at night. The Viking longhouse was not a cozy cottage, not a fairy tale cabin glowing with bright flames and warm laughter. It was a survival machine, carefully engineered to shield its inhabitants from a cold that could kill a man in minutes. When modern people picture Viking homes, they often imagine something simple: rough timber, smoky fires, and furs draped across benches. But the truth is far more impressive. The longhouse was a masterpiece of adaptation, designed by necessity, built with ingenuity, and refined over centuries of harsh living in a land where firewood was scarce and winter seemed endless. Step outside with me in your imagination. The year is 950. A storm has rolled in from the North Atlantic, and the snow is falling so hard it erases the horizon. The wind drives icy pellets against your face until your skin burns. You stumble across frozen ground, your boots sinking into drifts that swallow you to the knee. Somewhere ahead, the outline of a building takes shape. It is not grand. There are no turrets, no decorative carvings gleaming in the storm. It is long, low, and heavy, its roof thick with sod, its sides hunched into the earth as if bracing against the wind. This is a Viking longhouse, and from the outside it looks almost like a mound of earth itself, blending into the land it grew from. But step through the heavy wooden door, and you cross from death into survival. Inside, the world shifts. It is dim, smoky, and far from comfortable, yet it is alive. A central fire pit glows, not with roaring flames, but with a steady, controlled smolder. The air is heavy with the scent of burning peat, dried dung, and the lingering musk of animals. Families huddle along the walls, pressed together on raised wooden benches. Children curl beneath wool blankets. Men return from the cold, shaking snow from their cloaks, their beards frosted white. Women stir cauldrons over the fire, the steam rising to mix with smoke in the rafters. And not far away, animals shift in their stalls, sheep, goats, even cows, breathing warmth into the same shared space. This was not luxury. This was not leisure. This was engineering, survival by design. What made the Viking longhouse remarkable was not its beauty, but its function. At its heart, it was a fortress against nature. The walls were not thin planks nailed together, but thick layers of wood and earth, stacked and packed to trap warmth inside. Imagine insulation centuries before anyone invented fiberglass or modern foams. A longhouse wall might have 3 layers: wooden boards on the inside, a dense layer of earth or clay in the middle, and another wooden shell outside. The earth absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, creating a thermal buffer that kept the bitter cold at bay. It was a medieval version of climate control, built entirely from natural materials. The roof was even more impressive. Instead of fragile shingles or thatch that let heat slip away, the Vikings covered their longhouses with sod, thick slabs of earth, often 2 feet deep, layered with grass roots, still intact. In winter, that sod became a giant natural blanket, holding in heat like insulation, while in summer it helped keep the house cool. In spring, green grass would even sprout from the roof, disguising the building as part of the hillside. To an outsider, it may have looked primitive. To a Viking family, it was genius. The very land that threatened them with death became the material that preserved their lives. Beneath your feet, the floor told the same story. Cold air sinks, and the frozen ground beneath a house could leach heat from a body faster than any storm. The Vikings knew this well. They layered straw, animal hides, and even sheets of birch bark across the floor to form a barrier. These layers kept feet and bodies from direct contact with frozen earth, slowing the creep of cold into bones. In some cases, longhouses were even built partially into the ground, using the earth itself as insulation. Dug slightly below the surface, these homes took advantage of the soil's stable temperature, warmer than the frigid air above in winter and cooler during summer's brief reprieve. Every design choice had one goal: survival. The longhouse was not divided the way modern homes are. There were no cozy bedrooms, no private living rooms with doors to close. Instead, it was one vast hall, stretching as much as 75 feet in length and 20 feet across, depending on the family's wealth and resources. At the center, the fire pit provided light and heat. Along the walls, sleeping benches ran the length of the hall, wide enough for entire families to huddle together. Curtains made of heavy hides could be hung to create small, enclosed spaces, little pods of warmth inside the larger structure. Above, the rafters caught the smoke, which drifted slowly through a small hole in the roof. There were no chimneys because a chimney would have sucked away the very heat they needed. Instead, the smoke lingered, coating beams in soot, preserving the wood from insects, and providing a constant haze that stung the eyes but kept the cold at bay. And then there were the animals. In the modern world, we separate livestock from family homes, but in a Viking longhouse, they lived side by side. Animals were not simply resources for milk, wool, or meat. They were living space heaters. A single cow produces as much heat as a modern electric heater. Sheep radiate warmth like woolen furnaces. Horses, when brought inside, added not only body heat but also protection, alerting families to dangers outside. To maximize this effect, the Vikings built stalls for animals slightly lower than the living area. Heat from the livestock rose upward, warming the benches where families slept, while cold drafts stayed trapped near the ground. It was a perfect system. Biology turned into architecture. Sleeping in a longhouse was not comfortable by modern standards, but it was survivable. Families lay close together, wrapped in furs, their combined body heat creating what scientists today would call shared thermal mass. Curtains of hide added another layer of insulation, keeping precious warmth from escaping. Beneath the benches, straw and bark added more barriers, and sometimes food or firewood was stored under the sleepers, kept from freezing by their body heat. At night, glowing stones heated in the fire were wrapped in wool or fur and tucked beneath bedding, radiating warmth like ancient hot water bottles. Every detail was another step in a complex system designed to stretch survival as far as it could go. The longhouse was not only a shelter, it was a community center, a place where survival was shared. Entire families, sometimes extended relatives and neighbors, lived together under one roof. Privacy was rare, but warmth was abundant compared to the death waiting outside. Meals were cooked in the center, stories were told, tools were repaired, clothes were mended, and strategies for survival were planned. The very structure of the longhouse forced cooperation, reminding every Viking that survival was not a solitary act, but a collective one. In the darkest winters, when storms howled for weeks, the longhouse became both refuge and fortress, a machine of human endurance. Think about the psychological strength it must have taken to endure months inside such a space. The constant smoke, the smell of animals, the dampness of earth walls, the crowded closeness of bodies, all of it pressing in day after day. Yet the Vikings adapted. They accepted discomfort in exchange for survival. They treated their homes not as places of luxury, but as weapons against the cold. And in that mindset, they built not cottages, but survival machines. When historians and archaeologists uncover the remains of Viking longhouses today, they find more than just timber and earth. They find the blueprint of resilience. They find the layers of sod that once held in warmth. They find the post holes where massive beams stood, anchoring roofs heavy enough to withstand tons of snow. They find fire pits blackened with centuries of smoke, the very heart of survival for generations. These ruins tell a story that is every bit as dramatic as any Viking raid or voyage. They tell us how ordinary people lived through extraordinary cold, night after night, winter after winter. For the Vikings, the longhouse was not just shelter, it was life. It transformed scarcity into survival, weakness into strength, and the brutal reality of endless winter into something humans could endure. It was a fortress, not of stone, but of ingenuity. It was insulation carved from the earth itself, powered by animals, fueled by resourcefulness, and sustained by family. To stand inside one was to stand inside a machine built to outlast blizzards, to stare down nature, and to keep beating hearts alive when the world outside froze solid. The next time you picture the Vikings, don't just imagine them on the open sea with axes raised and sails full of wind. Imagine them here, in the longhouse, smoke curling in the rafters, animals shifting nearby, children bundled beneath hides, and adults whispering stories into the dark. Imagine the storm raging outside, snow stacking high against the walls, winds howling across the fjords. And then imagine that inside, against all odds, life persists. The longhouse did not look like much to outsiders. but to the Vikings, it was the most powerful tool they had. It was proof that with enough ingenuity, enough planning, and enough sheer stubbornness, even the longest winter could be endured. Close your eyes and imagine standing inside a Viking longhouse during the height of winter. The wind outside screams across the icy fjords, rattling the world like an angry god. Snow piles against the door until it creaks under the weight. The air is so cold that your breath turns into clouds the moment you exhale. Yet inside this seemingly simple structure, families survive. They do not survive because of roaring fires or endless piles of firewood. Those were luxuries they rarely had. They survive because their walls were built like armor. These were not flimsy partitions of wood. They were layered, deliberate, and designed to hold back the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes. Viking walls were not just barriers. They were machines of survival. The brilliance lay in the layers. A Viking longhouse wall was rarely a single plank. That would have been a waste of energy, heat, and resources. Instead, they built with a 3-layer system that would make modern architects pause in respect. On the inside, smooth wooden planks formed the interior shell. Behind those planks, a heavy core of packed earth or clay filled the space, dense and solid, acting as a natural insulator. On the outside, another wooden wall or a covering of sod completed the structure. Together, these layers formed something more than a wall. They formed a medieval insulation system, nature's version of climate control, long before anyone invented fiberglass or double-paned glass. Think of the earth as a thermal battery. During the day, even the weak winter sun or the faint warmth of a smouldering fire would seep into that packed soil. The earth absorbed the heat slowly, holding onto it like a sponge. Then, as night fell and the cold pressed in harder, the wall released that warmth back into the interior, keeping the temperature stable. It was primitive compared to our standards, but for a Viking family huddled on a sleeping bench, it could mean the difference between waking up alive or not waking up at all. The earth was their shield. It was heavy, solid, and unyielding, the very bones of the land repurposed to protect its people. And then there was the sod. Imagine thick mats of soil cut from the ground, grass and roots still bound together in dense slabs. These were laid across roofs and sometimes against the outer walls. In summer, the sod sprouted with green, blending the house into the hillside like camouflage. In winter, the sod turned into a blanket of earth, trapping heat inside and shielding the timber from the relentless cold. Snow piled on top of sod did not weaken it. In fact, it added another insulating layer. Instead of collapsing, the weight pressed the structure tighter, making the home warmer. What looked to outsiders like a mound of dirt was actually an ingenious defense against the elements. When you run your hand along a reconstruction of one of these walls, you can feel the density. The timber gives way to the gritty firmness of soil, and beyond that, the coarse surface of sod that once grew with life. To live inside such walls was to live inside nature itself, bent to human will. Unlike castles of stone or cabins of thin planks, the Viking longhouse was built with the landscape. It was part of the earth, and the earth was part of it. This was more than architecture. It was survival science, born not of textbooks, but of generations of trial, error, and necessity. Now imagine the experience of a Viking child lying awake on a winter night, listening to the storm outside. The walls creak, but they hold. Snow piles higher, but the thick layers of sod and soil only make the house warmer. The child presses closer to their siblings, wrapped in wool and fur, and breathes in the smoky air. The fire is low, embers glowing rather than roaring, but the room is not frozen. It is survivable. Why? Because the walls around them are alive with stored heat, radiating back into the hall, resisting the pull of the deadly cold outside. To that child, The longhouse does not feel like a miracle. It feels like home. But to us, it is a marvel of engineering. Think also of the labor it took to create these walls. Cutting and shaping planks required axes and saws. Hauling earth by the cartload and packing it into layers was back-breaking work. Cutting sod meant stripping sections of ground with long blades, rolling the mats, and carrying them to the building site. A longhouse did not appear overnight. It was the result of entire families and communities working together, bending raw nature into protective form. Each wall was a labor of survival, built with sweat and stubbornness, meant to last for generations, and many did. Archaeologists today still uncover outlines of these longhouses. The packed earth hardened like stone, the sod long decayed, but its imprint preserved. They are testaments to the durability of Viking design. Compare this to other medieval structures. In warmer regions, thin walls sufficed. In temperate climates, stone castles or simple timber houses stood well enough. But in Scandinavia, where the sun could vanish for weeks and the cold could kill livestock in their stalls, walls had to be different. They had to think not only about strength, but about heat. A Viking longhouse was not a castle meant to repel armies, nor a hut meant only for shelter. It was an insulation chamber, a living cocoon. Every plank, every sod mat, every handful of soil added up to a barrier that allowed humans to survive winters that might otherwise have erased them from history. The genius of these layered walls lies in their efficiency. Vikings did not waste. They used what they had. Wood was scarce, so they stretched it with earth. Sod was abundant, so they turned it into armor. The result was not pretty by modern standards, but it was brutally effective. The walls trapped warmth, muffled the wind, and created a stable environment inside. And when you think about it, this efficiency explains more than just how they survived. It explains how they thrived. Because their homes worked, because their walls held, they could spend energy on other things: farming, shipbuilding, trading, exploring. Without the protection of those layered walls, there would have been no Viking voyages, no sagas, no legends of raids and discoveries. The walls were the quiet foundation of everything else. Step closer to one of these reconstructed longhouses today, and you might notice something surprising. The silence. Outside, the wind rushes across the fields, howling and unrelenting. Inside, the sound muffles. The thick layers of earth and sod act like soundproofing, turning a raging storm into a distant murmur. For Viking families, this silence must have been more than comfort. It was sanity. To endure months of howling winds without rest would have been torture. The walls gave them peace as well as warmth, a shield not only for the body but for the mind. And what of fire? Inside these walls, fires could smolder for hours without fear of drafts stealing the heat. The earth held the warmth, the sod kept it from escaping, and the timber framed it all together. Smoke drifted slowly upward, caught in the rafters, seeping out only in thin streams through the roof. The beams above grew black with soot, but that soot preserved them, hardening the wood, making it resistant to insects and rot. Even the smoke had a purpose. Nothing in the Viking system was wasted. When you think about it, these walls tell a story of humanity itself. They remind us that survival has always been about adaptation, about finding ways to bend nature's harshness into something bearable. The Vikings did not conquer the cold with brute force. They partnered with the earth, layering its strength into their homes, turning dirt and wood into life-saving technology. Their longhouses may look primitive compared to modern buildings, but they were advanced in the only way that mattered. They kept families alive through winters longer than memory. So picture it again, a storm raging across the fjords, snow smothering the land, ice crawling across every surface. Outside, death waits. Inside, life continues. Children sleep, elders tell stories, warriors sharpen blades, mothers stir broth in heavy cauldrons. They live because the walls hold. They live because planks, packed earth, and sword have become something greater than their parts. They live because their ancestors discovered that nature itself could be the greatest insulator if you knew how to shape it. The layered walls of a Viking longhouse were more than construction. They were defiance. They were proof that even in the harshest environment, human ingenuity could carve out survival. To stand within them was to stand inside a fortress not of stone and steel, but of wood, earth, and willpower. And it was inside those walls that the Vikings endured the coldest nights, rising each morning not broken by winter, but ready to face it again, day after day, year after year. Imagine walking across a Viking settlement in the middle of summer. The air is crisp, the fjords shimmer in the sunlight, and the hills are dotted with longhouses that look almost like they grew from the earth itself. Their roofs are not gleaming tiles, not wooden shingles, not thatch alone, but thick slabs of sod alive with green grass. From a distance, you could mistake the rooftops for rolling fields, their surfaces sprouting flowers, moss, and grazing insects. This was not decoration, it was survival design. And when winter came, those same sod roofs that looked like meadows in summer transformed into heavy blankets of earth that trapped warmth and held back the merciless cold. To the Vikings, the sod roof was more than architecture. It was a shield. It was a blanket of the gods. The genius of a sod roof is its simplicity. Thick layers of earth cut from the ground were placed over timber beams and birch bark. The birch bark served as a waterproofing layer, keeping the rain from seeping into the wooden structure below. The sod, dense with roots and soil, acted as insulation, holding in warmth during the long winter months. In summer, it kept interiors cool by absorbing sunlight and creating a barrier against heat. In spring, grass sprouted once again, binding the sod together into a living roof. It was as though the earth itself had agreed to protect those who lived beneath it. Picture a Viking family inside their longhouse on a stormy January night. Snow is falling in heavy sheets, the wind howls with the sound of 1,000 wolves, and the temperature outside is so low it could freeze a cup of water in minutes. Yet inside, beneath the sod roof, the family survives. The fire smoulders low in the central pit, smoke curling toward the rafters. The walls of earth and timber do their part, but it is the roof that completes the fortress. Snow piles higher and higher, yet instead of crushing the house or freezing it, the snow acts as another insulating layer. The sod and soil beneath absorb the pressure, hold firm, and trap the precious heat rising from the fire below. What should have been a weakness becomes a strength. The blizzard makes the house warmer, not colder. To build a sod roof was no small task. It required not just strength, but foresight. First came the timber beams, heavy logs cut and shaped to span the longhouse. Across them, planks were laid and then coated with birch bark, chosen for its natural oils that made it water-resistant. Over this came the sod itself, cut from pastures and fields in thick slabs, rolled up and carried on backs or sledges to the building site. Each slab was placed carefully, roots facing down to grip the bark, soil facing up to hold the next layer. As the layers stacked, the roof grew heavier, sometimes weighing tens of tons. A poorly built frame would collapse under the weight, so the craftsmanship of the beams was critical. The Vikings built with precision because failure was not an option. A collapsed roof in the middle of winter meant death. Now think of the symbolism. A sod roof turned the house into part of the land. It blurred the line between human construction and nature's design. The grass growing on top in summer fed livestock. The roots bound the soil, preventing erosion and protecting the house from rain. Birds nested in the turf, adding life to the structure. The sod roof was not dead material. It was alive. It was an ecosystem resting above the heads of the family within, a living layer that gave and took in equal measure. And when the sagas speak of houses blending into the hillsides, of communities hidden from afar, it was the sod roof that made this possible. From the water, Viking settlements looked like mounds in the earth rather than villages waiting to be raided. Camouflage was not the goal, but it was a powerful side effect. For modern people, the idea of a dirt roof might sound primitive, even crude. But consider this. Sod roofs provided thermal insulation that rivals some modern materials. Thick earth traps heat far better than thin shingles or tiles. When snow fell, it became an extra blanket. When rain poured, the sod absorbed it, slowing the flow, and the birch bark below diverted it away. In short, sod roofs created a microclimate above the house, stabilizing temperatures and reducing the impact of weather extremes. Today, architects talk about green roofs as cutting-edge, eco-friendly design. The Vikings had already mastered the concept over 1,000 years ago. Inside, families felt the difference. Without the sod roof, smoke would escape too easily, heat would vanish into the air, and the longhouse would become as cold as the frozen fields outside. With it, the roof acted as a lid, holding warmth down, thickening the air until it clung to the skin. The rafters blackened with soot, the beams hardened, and the smell of smoke lingered everywhere. To a visitor, it might have seemed suffocating. To the Vikings, it was survival. Every cough, every teary eye stung by smoke was a small price to pay for life in a land that offered so little mercy. Imagine lying on a sleeping bench along the wall, wrapped in furs, your family pressed close beside you. Above your head is not just wood, but tons of earth. You can hear the wind howling beyond it, but the sound is muffled, distant. The storm cannot reach you here. You know the roof is strong. You watched it built, sod laid piece by piece, roots pressed into bark, soil packed tight. You know the snow piling above is not a threat but an ally. You feel the warmth of the fire, the heat of bodies, and the protection of the sod. You close your eyes, not in comfort, but in safety. That roof is more than shelter. It is the difference between life and death. Archaeologists uncovering the remains of Viking houses often find traces of these sod roofs still intact. Layers of compacted soil, hardened into slabs, bear witness to centuries of storms endured. The birch bark beneath is sometimes preserved, its oils still resisting decay, a ghostly reminder of the ingenuity behind the design. These remnants speak volumes about the Viking relationship with nature. They did not conquer it with steel and fire. They cooperated with it, using its strength to shield themselves. The sod roof was not an act of domination. It was an act of respect. The earth gave them life, and in return, they shaped it into protection. Consider, too, the sustainability of this design. Building a sod roof did not strip the land bare. The grass cut for slabs would regrow. The soil could be replenished. The birch bark peeled from trees was taken carefully, sometimes without killing the tree. These were renewable resources, used with care because waste was dangerous. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, the Vikings could not afford recklessness. Every resource mattered. Every slab of sod was a promise of another night endured, another winter survived. And so, the sod roof became not just practical, but cultural. It defined the Viking home. It marked their settlements. It symbolized their connection to the earth. When a Viking longhouse is reconstructed today, it is the sod roof that completes the image. Without it, the building looks incomplete, naked, vulnerable. With it, the house becomes whole, strong, alive. It becomes what it was always meant to be, a fortress disguised as a meadow, a shield disguised as a field, a blanket of the gods laid across the shoulders of humanity. So when you think of Viking survival, do not think only of axes and ships, of warriors and raiders. Think of the sod roof. Think of the families huddled beneath tons of earth, listening to the storm rage outside while their home stood firm. Think of the green grass sprouting in summer, animals grazing atop the very roofs that sheltered their owners. Think of the brilliance of using nature itself as insulation, turning soil and roots into life-saving armor. The sod roof was not glamorous, but it was genius. It was the quiet hero of the Viking Age, a design that made survival possible in a world where winter never truly ended. The next time you see a modern green roof, remember that this idea is not new. It is ancient, born in the icy north, perfected by people who had no choice but to innovate or perish. The sod roof was not just a roof. It was the living skin of a home, breathing with the seasons, shielding against storms, and proving that even in the harshest environment, humans could bend nature into partnership. For the Vikings, it was their greatest comfort. For us, it remains one of their greatest legacies. Step into a Viking longhouse in the middle of a Scandinavian winter, and the first thing you would notice is not just the smoke in the rafters or the steady glow of the fire pit. You would feel it beneath your feet. The floor itself was a battlefield, a constant war between warmth and the frozen earth below. Cold does not only descend from the air, it rises from the ground, creeping upward like an invisible enemy. For the Vikings, survival meant fighting on both fronts. Their walls and roofs guarded against blizzards and icy winds, but the floor was the hidden danger. A body lying on frozen soil could lose heat faster than it could generate it. Left unprotected, the earth would steal warmth in silence, night after night, until exhaustion and frostbite claimed the living. The Vikings, who endured winters longer than most of us can imagine, understood this enemy all too well. They fought back with straw, hides, bark, and ingenious designs that turned even the ground itself into a weapon of survival. Imagine a family gathering for the night. Outside, snow presses against the walls, and ice forms thick along the doorframe. The fire smoulders low in the center, casting dull orange light across the benches. The children crawl onto wooden platforms raised from the floor, wrapped in wool and fur. Beneath those platforms is not bare dirt, but layers of straw and bark, carefully laid down to create a barrier. The Vikings knew what modern campers know. The ground is the enemy. Cold earth drains heat relentlessly, and even the best fire cannot protect you if you are sleeping directly on frozen soil. So the people of the north armored their homes from below, laying down material after material until the earth was no longer a thief but a foundation. Straw was their first defense. Bundled in thick mats, it acted like natural insulation, trapping pockets of air that resisted the creeping chill. Spread across the floor, it turned frozen ground into something softer, warmer, and far more bearable. Each step sank slightly into the straw, muffling footsteps and adding a cushion beneath the feet. But straw alone was not enough. It degraded quickly, turned damp, and carried the smell of animals. So it was replaced often, refreshed like bedding, a routine chore that meant survival. Beneath straw, other layers worked silently. Birch bark, stripped in sheets from trees, was laid flat against the ground. Birch bark is waterproof, flexible, and strong. It created a barrier against moisture, stopping damp earth from soaking into the home. Together, straw and bark formed a partnership, one for insulation, one for dryness. Over these layers, animal hides were sometimes spread. Thick skins from reindeer, bear, or cattle served as rugs, adding more warmth and comfort. They also acted as an extra shield against drafts that might creep up from below. Imagine lying down on a sleeping bench above all this, wrapped in furs, with the warmth of your family beside you. The floor beneath has been transformed from frozen death into a silent ally. Without those layers, your breath would freeze on your lips by morning. With them, you endure. In some cases, the Vikings went further. They dug their homes partly into the ground, using the earth itself as a weapon against the cold. This was not a shallow choice, but a calculated one. Beneath the surface, the temperature of soil remains more stable than the air above. In winter, it is warmer than the frozen winds. By lowering their floors, they created homes that tapped into this natural thermal reservoir. Imagine stepping down into a dug-in longhouse. The walls rise around you, thick with earth and timber, and the floor lies lower than the snow-covered land outside. The wind howls across the roof, but inside the air is steady. The earth, though cold, provides stability, and with layers of straw and hides, the floor becomes a thermal buffer. The Vikings had turned the ground itself into insulation, bending the enemy into an ally. The design of the sleeping platforms added another layer of strategy. Raised wooden benches lined the walls of the longhouse, keeping bodies above the coldest air near the floor. Heat rises, and by elevating themselves, the Vikings claimed the warmest strata of air within the room. Beneath the benches, straw and firewood were sometimes stored, taking advantage of the residual heat from above. Food might also be kept there, safe from freezing by the warmth of human bodies. Imagine it. Grain sacks and dried fish tucked under sleeping families, warmed just enough to remain edible through the night. Nothing was wasted, not even the heat of a human resting above. For the Vikings, survival was not about comfort, it was about endurance. Their solutions to the problem of the floor reveal a deep understanding of nature. They knew that cold air sinks, that dampness spreads, and that layers protect. They did not have thermometers or scientific theories, but they had generations of experience. They had seen what happened to those who slept directly on the frozen ground. They had watched bodies weaken, joints stiffen, and lives fade when the earth was not tamed, and so they built homes that fought back, layer by layer, until the longhouse itself became a fortress from below as well as above. Picture the chores of daily life. Children gather straw from fields in autumn, tying it into bundles. Adults strip sheets of birch bark, careful not to kill the trees. Hunters bring back hides, cleaned and stretched, ready to be spread across the floor. Each material has a role, and each role matters. The ground is no longer just a surface, it is a battleground, one fought with tools of nature. Straw becomes armor, bark becomes shield, hides become blankets, and earth itself becomes the wall. This was not accidental. This was strategy. Now think about the psychological comfort it must have provided. To know that beneath your feet lay not just frozen soil, but carefully laid layers of warmth and protection. To walk across straw instead of ice. To feel the difference when storms raged outside, yet the floor beneath remained steady. It must have been a kind of reassurance, a silent promise from the builders of the house to its inhabitants. You are safe here, safe not in luxury, but in survival. Archaeologists today still find traces of these floor systems, compressed layers of straw turned into dark stains in the soil, bark fragments preserved by time, post holes marking where benches once stood above the floor. These remnants are not just curiosities. They are evidence of battle. They tell us that the Vikings fought the cold on every front. They did not only rely on fires or walls or roofs. They understood the importance of the ground itself, and they built accordingly. The floor of a Viking longhouse reminds us of something fundamental. Survival is not about a single solution. It is about layers. Just as they wore layers of clothing, Just as they built walls with layers of wood and earth, they insulated their floors with layer after layer until the cold had nowhere left to go. Each choice was simple, but together they formed a system as effective as any modern insulation. So picture it once more. A family huddled inside, smoke curling in the rafters, snow piling against the roof. The fire burns low, animals shift nearby, and children whisper under furs. Beneath them, the floor holds strong. Straw crackles softly, bark rests silent, hides add warmth, and the dug-in design traps heat. The storm outside rages, but inside, the family survives. They survive because the floor is not bare dirt. It is not weakness, it is armor, and like every other part of the Viking longhouse, it is a testament to human ingenuity in the face of unrelenting cold. The battle against frozen ground was never truly won. It was fought each night, each winter, each generation, but the Vikings endured because they learned to fight it smartly. They layered, they dug, they adapted, they turned the very earth that threatened them into a shield. The longhouse floor was not glamorous. It was not legendary like the dragon-proud ships or the stories of raids across seas, but it was the foundation upon which all else rested. Without it, the Vikings would not have lived long enough to carve their names into history. On a winter night in the Viking world, you would step into a longhouse expecting warmth, and the first thing to hit you would not be a rush of heat. It would be smoke, thick, heavy, pungent, curling through the air until your eyes watered and your throat burned. The rafters above were blackened from centuries of soot, beams hardened by fire's breath, and everything carried the sharp tang of smoke that never truly left. To a modern visitor, it might feel suffocating, unbearable, even dangerous. But to the Vikings, this was survival by design. They knew what many of us forget. Warmth is precious, and smoke is not the enemy when it means life. Their homes did not have chimneys, because a chimney would have betrayed them. A chimney would have stolen their heat, draining it skyward when they needed every scrap of warmth to cling to the walls, the benches, and their bodies. So instead, they let the smoke stay. It lingered, it filled, it coated, and in its own way, it saved. Imagine sitting on a wooden bench along the longhouse wall, wrapped in furs. Your family gathers close, and animals shift in their stalls just a few feet away. In the center of the hall, a fire smoulders, not blazing high but burning low, steady, constant. The flames lick gently at logs, peat, or dried dung, releasing a slow heat. Above it, smoke swirls lazily, curling up into the dim rafters. There is no stone chimney drawing it out. Instead, it seeps through a small hole in the roof, just enough to let it escape without creating a draft that would pull the warmth away. The smoke hangs in the air like a blanket, heavy and stubborn. It stings your eyes and coats your lungs, but it also keeps the warmth from fleeing. In the Viking world, survival was always about trade-offs, and smoke was a price worth paying. Why did they refuse chimneys? The answer is simple: efficiency. A roaring fire and a wide chimney may look impressive, but they are wasteful. Heat rises, and a chimney sucks that heat straight out into the sky. In a land where firewood was scarce, where every log or chunk of peat was hard-earned, the Vikings could not afford to let their warmth vanish so easily. Instead, they perfected the art of the smouldering fire. Slow, steady, quiet, and efficient, their fires were designed to last through the night, giving off steady heat without burning through precious fuel. The smoke was not an oversight. It was a solution, and smoke itself had benefits. The constant haze rising into the rafters preserved the very structure of the home. Beams blackened and hardened, resisting rot and insects. Pests that might have infested the roof, mites, beetles, and woodworms, could not survive in the smoke-soaked wood. The smell, sharp and earthy, also deterred animals from creeping inside. In a world without chemical preservatives, smoke was nature's gift, sealing the longhouse against decay. What we see today as inconvenience was, in truth, innovation. Think also of what it meant to live in that haze day after day. Your eyes would tear constantly, your lungs would feel heavy, your clothes would smell perpetually of fire. Children would grow up in that smoky air, their bodies adapting, their senses dulled to what outsiders might find overwhelming. Archaeological studies even suggest that Viking skeletons bear signs of smoke exposure, lungs scarred by a lifetime of inhaling soot. Yet these were the same lungs that carried them across oceans, the same bodies that endured winters, the same people who thrived in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. What might have seemed damaging was to them survivable, because the alternative, clear air and freezing cold, was not survivable at all. At night, the fire itself was a marvel of strategy. Flames were not left to burn wildly. Instead, logs were banked, embers covered with ash to smoulder slowly. Glowing stones were pulled from the pit, wrapped in fur or hides and tucked beneath bedding. These stones radiated warmth for hours, silent and steady, without the waste of a roaring blaze. The fire pit itself was often shallow, shaped like a cone to spread heat evenly across the room. Every detail mattered, every design choice tuned to survival, and when the Vikings burned alternative fuels, peat bricks cut from marshes or dried animal dung, they produced long-lasting fires that smoked heavily but stretched supplies further. The air might grow thick and acrid, but the house stayed warm, and that was what mattered. Picture the ceiling of a longhouse after years of such living. The beams are black, almost polished by smoke. The soot has soaked into every surface, preserving wood like tar. Hanging from those rafters are dried fish, herbs and meat, cured not only by salt, but by smoke. The very air of the home becomes part of food storage, another layer of survival strategy. What irritates the eyes also fills bellies through the winter. The home becomes not just a shelter, but a smokehouse, a preservation chamber. This was no accident. This was wisdom passed down through generations who understood that survival meant making every element work for you. Now imagine a storm outside. The wind is relentless, the snow relentless, and the world is frozen. Inside, the longhouse glows faintly with ember light. Smoke hangs thick in the rafters, its smell woven into every plank and hide. The air is warm, heavy, protective. Children breathe it in as they sleep pressed close to their parents. Animals shift in their stalls, adding their warmth to the air. Above, the sod roof traps everything inside, the heat, the smoke, the life. Without chimneys, without bright fires, without wasted logs, the Vikings endured. Modern people sometimes laugh at the idea of houses without chimneys, picturing them as crude or primitive. But the truth is the opposite. The lack of chimneys was not ignorance, it was brilliance. The Vikings understood energy efficiency in a way that modern societies are only beginning to relearn. Their homes were self-sustaining systems, recycling heat, preserving wood, curing food, and making every ounce of fuel count. Smoke was not a flaw, it was a tool. And so the Vikings lived in homes that were more than just shelters. They were machines of survival, powered by controlled fire, sealed by smoke, and designed with precision. A visitor from a warmer climate might choke on the air, stumble back into the snow, and call it unbearable. But to a Viking, that smoke meant safety. It meant that tomorrow would come, that their children would wake, that their people would endure another night in a land where nature showed no mercy. Think of the sagas told in that smoky haze. Warriors recounting raids, mothers singing lullabies, elders whispering myths of gods and giants, all beneath rafters blackened with generations of fire. The smoke did not just preserve the beams, it preserved memory, weaving itself into the very fabric of Viking culture. Each cough, each sting of the eye was a reminder of the cost of survival and the cleverness that made it possible. In the end, the Viking longhouse teaches us that survival is not about comfort, it is about adaptation. The lack of chimneys was not a mistake. It was a deliberate act of engineering, a refusal to let precious warmth escape. Smoke without chimneys was not a failure of design. It was the reason the design worked at all, and it is a lesson that echoes across centuries. Sometimes what seems unpleasant is exactly what keeps us alive. Step into a Viking longhouse on a night when the cold outside could split stone. The fire in the pit glows low, smouldering on peat and dung because firewood is scarce. Smoke curls into the rafters, thick and bitter, but it keeps the warmth from slipping away. The air is heavy, the walls hold steady, but the real secret of survival is not just in the fire or the sod roof above. It is standing and breathing just a few feet away. The true heaters of the Viking world walked on 4 legs. To modernize, the idea of keeping animals inside the house feels strange, even unthinkable. Today we keep cows in barns, sheep in pastures, goats in sheds, and dogs in kennels. Our homes are separated from livestock by walls and fields. But the Vikings lived in a world where firewood was not reliable, where the cold could kill as surely as hunger, and where every ounce of heat mattered. They knew that living bodies radiate warmth, and so they turned animals into survival allies. In the Viking longhouse, humans and animals shared the same roof. It was not a matter of luxury or convenience. It was life and death. Imagine entering the hall at night. Families huddle on raised benches along the walls, wrapped in hides, children pressed against parents. Just a few steps away, animals shift in their stalls. A cow exhales a cloud of steam. Sheep nestle together, their wool thick and radiating heat. Chickens rustle softly, feathers fluffed against the cold. Each animal gives off warmth, steady and constant, as natural as breath. A single cow can radiate the equivalent of a modern space heater. A cluster of sheep is like a walking blanket, and goats add their heat to the air. Horses sometimes stood near the doorway, acting not only as a source of warmth but as a warning system against wolves or raiders. This was no accident. It was design. The longhouse was built as a shared ecosystem of survival, where animals and humans created warmth together. The stalls for livestock were often set slightly lower than the living platforms. This was more than a matter of space. It was strategy. Heat rises. By placing the animals in depressions or pens beneath the human sleeping areas, their body heat drifted upward, filling the hall with warmth. The cold air sank to the lowest levels, trapped near the floor, while the heat of cows, sheep, and goats rose toward the benches. Imagine lying in your bed, the steady warmth of your own family close beside you, and just beyond the wooden partition, the radiating heat of living animals drifting up to you. The longhouse became not just a building, but a natural furnace, powered by biology. For the Vikings, animals were more than food or labor. They were partners in endurance. A family's survival was bound to the animals they owned. Livestock meant milk, wool, meat, and bone, but in winter, livestock also meant warmth. It is no coincidence that Viking law codes placed heavy penalties on stealing or harming another's animals. To take a man's cow was not just theft of food, it was theft of heat. It was a strike against his family's ability to survive the night. Animals were woven into the very core of life, not only as resources for farming and raiding, but as heaters, guardians, and companions in the war against the cold. Now picture the sensory world of a Viking longhouse filled with animals. The air is thick with smoke, but also with the earthy smell of straw, manure, and damp hides. The soundscape is alive, the lowing of cows, the bleating of sheep, the rustle of chickens settling, the occasional snort of a horse stamping near the door. To modern noses and ears, it might seem unpleasant, overwhelming. But to a Viking child falling asleep on a bench, these were the sounds and smells of safety. Each breath of steam from a cow, each shift of woolly bodies, was warmth added to the air. In a land where nature itself tried to freeze human life out of existence, the closeness of animals meant survival. Archaeologists reconstructing Viking longhouses have found evidence of this arrangement. Soil layers inside ancient structures show traces of animal waste mixed with straw, clear signs that livestock shared the space. The layout of post holes and partitions suggests designated stalls built along one end of the hall, separated but not sealed off. This was not disorder, it was deliberate planning. The longhouse was engineered to bring humans and animals together in a way that maximized warmth without losing control. It was a system of survival where biology and architecture blended seamlessly. Think about the psychology of this. For us, sleeping beside animals might feel degrading, a mark of poverty. But for the Vikings, it was wisdom. It was a partnership. The warmth of animals was as reliable as the rising sun, steady through the night when fires burned low. A Viking farmer might stroke the neck of his cow, not just with gratitude for milk, but for the heat that kept his children alive. Sheep were not just wool on legs. They were blankets that walked, breathed, and lived. Even dogs curled at the feet of their owners were more than companions. They were radiators wrapped in fur, guardians whose warmth and vigilance meant another day survived. The human body itself radiates the heat of a 100-watt bulb. Multiply that by a household of 10 people and add the heat of 10 or more animals, and the result is a shared furnace. Scientists call this a thermal mass. The Vikings did not have the language for it, but they had the practice. They knew that bodies together meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. The longhouse became a living engine, fueled by fire, insulated by sod, and heated by the collective breath of man and beast alike. Picture the scene again, but deeper this time. Outside, the storm rages. The wind howls across the fjords, and snow buries the world in silence. Inside, the hall is alive with warmth. Embers glow, smoke lingers, families huddle, and animals breathe steady heat. The architecture channels the warmth upward. The sod roof holds it down, the walls trap it in, and the animals sustain it through the night. This is not a cottage. This is not a farmstead. This is a survival machine powered by the living bodies of its inhabitants. Even the sagas and folk tales echo this reality. Animals are often depicted as companions, protectors, or signs of wealth, but behind those stories lies the practical truth. The more animals you had, the warmer your longhouse. Wealth was not only measured in gold or silver, but in cows and sheep, in the heat they gave, in the nights they made survivable. For a poor family with only a few goats, the cold pressed harder. For a wealthier household with cows and horses, the longhouse glowed with greater warmth. Status was not just about luxury. It was about how comfortably you could endure the winter, how warm your home could be when the sea froze and the sun vanished. To live among animals was also to live in rhythm with them. The Viking family rose when the animals stirred, shared the heat of their breath through the long night, and relied on their warmth as much as their milk and wool. This intimacy shaped their worldview, blending human and animal lives in ways we often forget. The line between livestock and family blurred because in the deepest winters, survival did not care about categories. It cared only about warmth. The Vikings teach us a lesson here, one as relevant now as it was then. Survival is not always about great inventions or grand victories. Sometimes it is about recognizing the resources around you, no matter how humble, and using them to their fullest. To us, a cow is milk, a sheep is wool, a horse is labor. To the Vikings, these were all true, but they were also heaters, partners in the war against cold. They understood that survival was not solitary, it was communal. It was shared between humans and animals alike. So when you imagine a Viking longhouse, do not picture only the warriors sharpening blades or the women stirring cauldrons. Picture the cows in their stalls, the sheep pressed together, the goats shifting in straw, the horses stamping near the door. Picture the air alive with steam from breath, heavy with warmth that wrapped around the family on the benches. Picture the dogs curled close to their owners, loyal guardians and heaters in one. And picture how this living system kept death from the door. The longhouse was more than wood and earth. It was more than sod and smoke. It was alive, powered by the fire pit, the people and the animals within. The animals were not an afterthought. They were central, woven into the very design. They were not kept inside because the Vikings lacked barns. They were kept inside because their warmth was the difference between life and death. The animals were the unsung heaters of the Viking world, the quiet radiators that allowed humans to endure winters that might otherwise have ended them. When the blizzards ended, when spring thawed the earth, when ships were built and sails raised, it was because through those long nights, the animals had stood beside their human families, giving warmth, giving life. The Viking age was not just carried on the shoulders of warriors, it was carried on the backs of cows, the wool of sheep, the strength of horses, and the loyalty of dogs. Without them, there would have been no survival, no raids, no sagas. The animals were the hearth-made flesh, the silent fire that never went out, and for the Vikings, that was the truest form of warmth, the warmth of life itself, shared heartbeat to heartbeat, beneath the same roof. Imagine walking into a Viking longhouse after the sun has disappeared below the horizon and the night has turned the world outside into a frozen wasteland. The air is thick with smoke from the fire pit. The scent of damp wool, animal hides, and straw lingers everywhere, and the low murmur of voices fills the hall. The fire glows faintly in the center, throwing orange light across faces, flickering against blackened rafters. But the flames are kept low and steady because fuel is precious. The cold presses relentlessly against the sod roof and layered walls, and the frozen ground outside is a constant reminder of the danger waiting beyond the door. Yet in this dim, smoky hall, the family endures. And one of the simplest, smartest tricks they used to survive was knowing where to sleep. They did not lie on the floor where the air was coldest. They slept higher, on raised benches along the walls where the warmth gathered. Heat rises. It is a principle so basic that even without scientific knowledge, the Vikings knew it through experience. They had no thermometers, no written physics to explain convection, but they could feel it. Sit near the ground, and the cold sank into your bones. Climb onto a bench, and the air pressed warmer against your skin. It was a lesson learned through generations of hardship, and they adapted their homes accordingly. The sleeping benches that lined the longhouse were not mere furniture. They were survival platforms, carefully placed at the right height to lift families out of the dead zone of cold air and into the layer where smoke and warmth collected. Picture these benches running the length of the hall, built sturdy from thick planks, often wide enough to hold entire families. They stood above the floor by a few feet, just enough to escape the cold air trapped at ground level. Beneath them, straw, bark, and hides added insulation, while sometimes firewood or food was stored, warmed by the body heat of the sleepers above. The benches themselves were lined with furs and wool, layers of softness that trapped heat. At night, children curled close to parents, elders pressed against the younger, and bodies created a chain of warmth. Above them, the smoke lingered just high enough not to suffocate, but low enough to trap heat near the ceiling. The benches placed the family in the sweet spot of the longhouse atmosphere, not too high where smoke thickened, not too low where cold crept. Think of the psychology behind this arrangement. To us, beds are about comfort, about softness, about privacy. For the Vikings, beds were about strategy. Position was survival. To lie on the ground was to risk frostbite, illness, even death. To climb onto the bench was to step into safety. It was the difference between shivering in damp straw and sleeping through the night in survivable warmth. The longhouse was an engine of endurance, and the benches were its platforms of protection. In some homes, these benches were curtained with heavy hides or woven cloth. Imagine pulling a thick hide across the front of your sleeping alcove, creating a pocket of warmth sealed from drafts. Inside, the space became a cocoon. Body heat bounced back from the fur walls, shared warmth grew with each person inside, and the bitter chill outside could not breach the curtain. These curtained benches were like medieval sleeping pods, centuries before the word existed. They turned cold nights into manageable ones, not luxurious but survivable, which was all that mattered. And the benches were not only for rest, they were places of storytelling, of teaching, of family life. In the smoky glow of the fire, families sat on the raised platforms to eat, to carve, to mend clothes. The benches were safe zones, elevated from the damp earth, warmed by the collected heat of bodies, and shielded by the design of the hall. A Viking child might fall asleep there to the sound of sagas recited by elders, the voice of a parent telling tales of Odin or Thor while the fire smouldered low. The child's dreams were not born in comfort, but in survival made possible by elevation, by the strategic placement of a wooden platform in the right layer of air. Archaeologists studying the ruins of longhouses often find outlines where these benches once stood. Post holes and compacted soil marked the spaces along the walls. The benches were permanent, not temporary beds. They were part of the architecture, as integral as the fire pit or the roof beams. The Vikings understood that the house was not just walls and a roof. It was a system, a balance of heat and cold, smoke and air, bodies and space. And in that system, the sleeping bench was a critical piece of technology, as vital as the ship's keel or the warrior's shield. Consider also the symbolism. To sleep higher was not just survival, it was status. Wealthier families often claimed the warmest benches, closest to the fire, or the most sheltered spots. Guests of honor slept in places of comfort. Servants or thralls, by contrast, often slept nearer to the floor, where the air was colder, where drafts crept in, where survival was harder. Even in the longhouse, warmth reflected hierarchy. The physics of heat rising became a metaphor for society itself. Those above endured with more comfort, those below suffered more of the cold. Yet all shared the same roof, the same air, the same survival machine. Imagine the visual of a longhouse at night. The fire pit glows in the center, embers pulsing red. Shadows flicker against the walls. Along the benches, bodies lie in rows, wrapped in fur and wool, breath rising in little clouds. Curtains sway faintly, stirred by drafts. The air is smoky, heavy, but warm enough. Beneath the benches, straw rustles as a dog shifts, curling close to the feet of its master. Beyond the partition, cows exhale steam, their warmth drifting upward. The architecture channels it all, the fire, the animals, the bodies, into one atmosphere of survival. And at the heart of it are the benches, lifting families into the layer where heat and smoke meet. The Vikings may not have spoken of convection currents or air density, but they knew them through experience. They felt the warmth rise, They felt the chill sink, and they adapted their homes to match the laws of nature. The longhouse became not only a shelter, but a science, a system where every element had a role. Sod roof above, layered walls around, insulated floors below, animals breathing heat beside, and benches lifting bodies into warmth. It was a harmony of necessity, a masterpiece of survival engineering disguised as simplicity. To lie on a Viking sleeping bench was not comfort as we know it. It was the sensation of enduring in a world that wanted you gone. It was the press of fur against skin, the weight of another body close, the warmth of animals and fire drifting toward you. It was the knowledge that beneath you the ground was frozen, but you were lifted above it. It was the strategy of survival expressed in wood and hide. And in that strategy, night after night, winter after winter, the Vikings endured. So when you picture a Viking longhouse, do not just imagine warriors sharpening swords or mothers stirring cauldrons. Picture the benches, picture the families climbing onto them, drawing hides across their alcoves, curling into furs and sleeping high in the smoky warmth. Picture the children drifting into dreams of gods and heroes while the storm outside rages on. Picture the way the benches turned physics into protection, raising bodies into the air where survival waited. The longhouse was a fortress of endurance, and the benches were its battlements, defending against the enemy that crept from the ground and pressed from the sky. They were not mere furniture. They were lifelines. And in their quiet, practical design, they reveal the heart of Viking ingenuity, to endure, to adapt, and to survive the coldest nights humanity has ever known. Picture a longhouse after the fire has been banked low for the night. The embers glow faintly, sending soft pulses of orange into the smoky air. Families climb onto wooden platforms built along the walls, benches wide enough to hold several people pressed close together. These benches are not open surfaces. Many are curtained with thick animal hides or woven cloth, creating enclosed compartments. Once the curtain is drawn, the body heat of those inside begins to build. Breath fogs the air, the warmth of furs and cloaks accumulates, and the pod becomes a miniature chamber of survival. Outside the curtain, the hall may be dim and smoky, the temperature harsh. Inside, within the curtained bed, it is survivable, warmer, safer, and sealed against drafts. The brilliance of these sleeping pods was their layering. Just as the walls of the longhouse had layers of wood, earth, and sod, so too did the beds. The wooden frame lifted sleepers above the cold air that pooled near the ground. Beneath the platform, straw or bark formed another insulating barrier, blocking the frozen earth from leaching away heat. On the bench itself, more straw, hides or wool padding added softness and insulation. Over the sleepers, furs and cloaks trapped the rising warmth of their bodies, and enclosing it all, the hide curtain sealed the pod, preventing precious heat from escaping. It was not luxury, it was survival architecture in miniature. Now imagine the feeling of lying down inside such a space. The air is close, heavy with the smell of wool, sweat, and smoke. Your siblings or children press against you, sharing their warmth. A dog curls at your feet, radiating the heat of its body into yours. Above you, the sod roof groans under snow. Beyond the wall, the wind howls. But here, in this pod, you are shielded. You can feel the cold outside like a distant threat, but it cannot reach you. Your body becomes part of the system, your heat absorbed and returned by the furs and hides around you. You are not simply sleeping, you are surviving in a cocoon carved by necessity. The Vikings understood the importance of position and containment. They knew that cold air sinks and drafts creep along the floor. By lifting themselves onto benches, and sealing their pods, they escaped the worst of it. They also knew that warmth multiplies when bodies share space. A single person in a pod was warm. A family pressed together was far warmer. Every human was a furnace of heat, each radiating like a 100-watt bulb. Multiplied by 4, 5, or 6 bodies, the pod became a shared heater. It was biology turned into architecture, and it worked. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. The remains of longhouses show the outlines of raised sleeping platforms along the walls. Traces of organic material, straw, bark, animal hair, suggest bedding that once filled these spaces. Written accounts from later centuries describe enclosed beds with curtains, small chambers built into larger rooms, where warmth could be trapped in small spaces. These pods were not unique to the Vikings. Variations appeared across northern Europe. But in Scandinavia, they were perfected into survival tools, tailored to the brutal winters of the north. Think also of the hierarchy embedded in these sleeping arrangements. The warmest, most protected benches were reserved for the household heads, elders, or guests of honor. Servants and thralls often slept in less favorable spots, closer to the floor or farther from the fire. Warmth was survival, and survival was status. Yet even the poorest family member benefited from the system. Everyone, from the head of the household to the child pressed against their mother, shared the same architecture of endurance. In a world where equality was rare, cold was a force that made people depend on one another. The pod design also reveals something deeper about Viking psychology. They lived in a world of open halls, shared meals, and communal labor. Privacy was minimal. Yet within the curtained beds, there was a sense of enclosure, of intimacy, of small, private worlds carved out of the communal hall. Couples could whisper in the dark. Children could hide under furs. Elders could rest in peace. These pods were not only about warmth. They were about carving human space in the middle of hardship, a tiny taste of separation from the chaos of life. The curtain was as much emotional comfort as physical insulation. Picture a winter night when food is scarce, storms are endless, and fear of wolves or raiders lingers. The family draws the hides across their pod, tucks children close, and lies in silence. The fire glows faintly beyond the curtain, smoke drifts upward, animals shift in their stalls. But inside the pod, it feels almost like a world apart, a world where warmth builds, where heartbeat and breath become the rhythm of survival, where bodies knit together into a fortress of heat. Outside the pod, the night is merciless. Inside, life endures. The beds also had practical uses beyond sleep. During the day, they served as seating areas, workspaces, or storage. Beneath the platforms, firewood, tools, or even food might be stored, warmed by the heat of bodies above. The pods were not wasted space. They were multifunctional, part of the economy of survival where nothing went unused. The Vikings understood efficiency not as a choice, but as necessity. Their pods were proof of this. Compact, layered, efficient, and endlessly practical. To us, the idea of sleeping in a curtained wooden box lined with straw and hides might sound uncomfortable, but consider the alternative, lying on the ground, exposed to drafts, with only a fire to guard you. Fires died, wood ran out, smoke stung the lungs, but the pod held steady. It trapped what could not be wasted, human heat, and in that trapped warmth, families made it through nights that would have frozen the unprepared. When we imagine Viking life, it is easy to see only the battles, the ships, the raids, and the glory. But their true strength lay in moments like these, in the quiet pods where children dreamed, where elders whispered sagas, where families endured the winter one night at a time, The longhouse was a survival machine, but the pods were its engines, multiplying warmth, preserving bodies, and making sleep possible when the cold pressed hardest. So the next time you picture a Viking home, do not stop at the smoky fire pit or the sod roof. Picture the benches along the walls, the curtains drawn, the straw beneath, the hides above. Picture the pods glowing faintly in ember light, each one a little furnace of life. Picture the people inside, pressed close, their warmth pooling, their survival ensured not by firewood or wealth, but by clever design and shared endurance. The Vikings did not wait for comfort. They built it themselves, layer by layer, until their beds became cocoons of survival. And in those pods, in the dead of winter, they proved that even in the harshest conditions, humanity could outwit the cold. The science behind it is simple, though the Vikings would not have called it science. Stones absorb heat. Heated in a fire, they can reach temperatures over 150 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes even higher. Wrapped and insulated, they release that heat gradually, turning into little radiators that last for hours. Unlike wood, which burns away, or fire, which requires constant feeding, stones store their warmth and give it back without waste. The Vikings knew this, not through books or formulas, but through centuries of practice. They had learned that a stone heated at dusk could keep children alive until dawn. It was a lesson written not in ink, but in survival. Imagine the comfort of climbing into your curtained bed on a night when frost covers every surface. You slide beneath wool blankets and furs, and your feet touch something warm. Not a fire, not a body, but a stone, radiating heat like the sun captured in its core. That warmth spreads through the bedding, turning the pod into a small oven. You curl around it, and your shivering slows, your muscles relax, and you drift into sleep. The stone does not blaze, it does not flicker, it does not demand more fuel. It simply gives back what the fire gave it, quietly, patiently, until morning. These hot stones were more than survival hacks. They were a sign of the Viking genius for efficiency. Firewood was scarce, peat and dung burned low, and animals radiated warmth but could not be everywhere at once. Stones were abundant. The earth itself provided them. Once heated, they required nothing more, no feeding, no tending. They were passive heaters, silent allies against the winter. In some homes, several stones would be heated at once, distributed among the beds, turning each curtained alcove into a survival chamber. The fire did not have to roar all night because the stones carried its strength forward into the hours of darkness. The fire pits themselves were often shaped to enhance this system. Some were shallow cones, designed not just for cooking, but for heating stones evenly. Large flat rocks were placed deliberately in the pit to absorb heat, ready to be pulled out at night. This was not improvisation, it was design. The Vikings had turned their hearths into charging stations for their ancient heaters, systems that blended architecture, biology, and geology into one seamless machine of endurance. Consider the other benefits. Heated stones, dried damp clothes hung near them, warded off frost from bedding, and sometimes even doubled as cooking aids. A stone placed in a pot of water would heat it quickly without wasting more fuel. The same principle that warmed a bed could warm a meal. The Vikings used every resource to its fullest, bending nature's laws to their will. In a land where waste was death, hot stones became one of the most ingenious tools of survival. Think also of the symbolism. Fire was sacred in Norse culture, tied to life, gods, and creation. Stones pulled glowing from the fire carried a piece of that sacred energy. To lay one in your bed was to sleep beside a fragment of the hearth's heart, a captured ember that gave its life quietly for yours. Children must have seen them as magical, glowing red and hissing when first removed from the coals. Adults must have seen them as reassurance, as allies in a world of cold and darkness. The sagas may not sing of hot stones, but without them, there may have been no sagas to tell. Now imagine the longhouse in the dead of night. The storm outside screams louder, snow piles higher, and the sod roof groans under the weight. Inside, the fire is low, embers glowing faintly. Smoke lingers in the rafters, heavy and dark. On the benches, families curl close in curtained pods. Beneath the firs, hot stones glow invisibly, radiating warmth into the small enclosures. The children sleep more soundly, the adults breathe easier, the animals shift in the straw, adding their heat. The house is a machine of survival, each part working together, walls trapping heat, roof holding it in, animals radiating, bodies sharing, and stones glowing. The storm cannot break through. The night is endured. Archaeologists and historians recognize the brilliance of this system. Accounts from later centuries in northern Europe describe the same practice, heating stones in fire and using them for warmth. It is one of those timeless solutions that seems obvious once you see it, but only those who lived in constant battle with the cold discovered its true value. The Vikings were not content to let firewood burn away. They understood how to stretch every ounce of energy. The stones were proof of their relentless efficiency. To us, the idea might seem quaint, even primitive, but the principle has never gone away. Today, we use hot water bottles, electric heating pads, and thermal packs. All are descendants of the same idea. Store heat in a medium, release it slowly into the body, survive the cold night. The Vikings did it with stone, hides, and embers. They built a system that was as clever as anything we use now, perhaps even more sustainable. So when you think of a Viking longhouse, do not just picture the smoke and the sod, the animals and the fire. Picture the moment when glowing stones were pulled from the hearth, wrapped carefully, and carried to the beds. Picture children curling their toes against them, elders sighing as warmth spread through aching bones, families drawing close as the night pressed down. Picture the silence of survival, broken only by the hiss of stone cooling slowly in the dark. The Vikings did not merely endure the cold, they outsmarted it, one glowing ember, one radiant stone at a time. The hot stones were not legendary weapons or epic voyages. They were not carved in runes or sung in sagas. But they were just as important. They were the quiet allies, the hidden heroes of the Viking night. Without them, fires would have burned out too quickly, fuel supplies would have vanished, and families might not have made it through the winter. With them, mornings came, children grew, ships were built, and the Viking world sailed into history. Survival was never one great act of defiance. It was hundreds of small, clever tricks, and glowing stones, tucked beneath beds in the dead of winter, were one of the cleverest of them all. To modern minds, Scandinavia conjures visions of endless forests, tall pines, dark spruce, and birch groves stretching as far as the eye can see. But the truth of the Viking world was far more complex. In many regions, especially the far north and wind-swept coasts, trees were scarce. Those that did grow were stunted by harsh winds, thin soil, and long winters. Even in southern forests, wood could not be taken endlessly. It had to be cut, dried, hauled, and carefully rationed. A family could not simply burn logs night after night without quickly exhausting their supply. Winter lasted half the year, sometimes longer, and no stack of logs was big enough to sustain a roaring fire every evening. Firewood, therefore, became a luxury, something to stretch, to hoard, to replace with whatever else the land could provide. So when the wood ran out, the Vikings turned to creativity. The first alternative was peat. In the marshes and bogs of northern Europe, peat formed over centuries, layers of decayed plants compressed into dense blocks. With the right tools, it could be cut in bricks, stacked, and left to dry. Once dried, peat burned slowly, releasing a steady heat that lasted far longer than a log. It did not blaze bright, but it smouldered, perfect for long nights when fuel had to be stretched as far as possible. Imagine a Viking farmer trudging into the bog in summer, cutting square bricks of sodden peat, hauling them home to stack in great piles. By winter, those bricks would be dry, ready to burn. In the fire pit, they glowed red, releasing thick smoke and the smell of earth. For the family gathered around, it was not the fragrance of pine or oak, but the assurance of survival. Peat had its drawbacks. The smoke was acrid, thick, and choking, worse than wood. It left residue on walls, beams, and lungs alike, but it was plentiful, renewable, and free. In some regions, entire households depended on it. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows layers of ash that match peat fuel, proof that these bricks of ancient earth were as much a part of survival as livestock or sod roofs. To us, it may seem humble, even unpleasant. To them, it was life. When peat was scarce, or when even those stores ran out, the Vikings turned to another resource, animal dung. To modern ears, the idea sounds foul, desperate, even unthinkable. But dried dung, pressed into cakes, burns with surprising efficiency. Across history, from the Mongolian steppes to the deserts of North Africa, people have used dung as fuel, and the Vikings were no different. The longhouse already housed animals, cows, sheep, goats, and their waste was not thrown away. It was gathered, dried, and stored. Once dried, it lost its stench and hardened into usable fuel. Tossed into the fire pit, it smoldered, adding precious hours of warmth. It was not glamorous, not romantic, but it kept families alive when the cold pressed hardest. Imagine a Viking woman gathering dried dung in a basket, carrying it into the smoky hall, and feeding it into the embers. The children might wrinkle their noses at the thought, but when the warmth spread, they curled deeper into their hides and whispered less about the smell. Survival did not care about comfort, it cared about heat, and dung gave it. There were other fuels too. Brushwood and twigs, though they burned quickly, were gathered in great bundles to light fires or sustain embers. Driftwood washed ashore from the sea, carried by currents from distant lands, was prized as treasure. Imagine combing the beaches after a storm, finding a twisted log carried for miles, salted by the ocean, and hauling it home. The salt made it burn oddly, sometimes spitting, sometimes hissing, but it burned nonetheless. In a land where every scrap of fuel mattered, even the ocean provided when the forests could not. The fire itself was managed with discipline. It was never allowed to burn wastefully. Flames were kept low, embers carefully banked under ash to last through the night. In the morning, a few twigs or scraps would reignite the coals, coaxing the fire back to life without wasting precious fuel. Families learned to treat fire not as entertainment, but as currency. Every flicker had value, every ember was potential. When the woodpile dwindled, and peat bricks smoked in the pit, and dung cakes glowed faintly red, the Vikings still kept the fire alive. It was their heart, their anchor, their shield against the endless cold. Think of the sensory world of such a night. The air is thick, filled with the earthy scent of peat, the acrid bite of dung smoke, the tang of salt from driftwood. It clings to skin, hair, and clothes, seeping into everything. To us, it would seem unbearable. To the Vikings, it was normal, expected, and even comforting. The smell of burning peat was the smell of life continuing. The smoke might sting the eyes, but it meant another morning would come. This resourcefulness reveals something profound about Viking culture. They were not reckless warriors who only cared for plunder and glory. They were farmers, builders, and survivors who knew the value of every scrap of resource their land offered. They did not wait for abundance. They made do with scarcity. They turned bogs, barns, and beaches into sources of heat, bending nature itself into cooperation. Their ships may have carried them across seas, but it was their ingenuity at home that allowed them to live long enough to build those ships. Imagine, again, the longhouse in the depths of winter. The fire burns with peat bricks, smouldering red, the smoke rising slowly into the rafters. A few dried dung cakes glow faintly, keeping the embers alive. Driftwood crackles oddly, hissing as the salt burns off. Families huddle close, animals shift in their stalls, and the warmth, though thin, holds. Outside, snow piles against the door, the wind screams, and the world freezes. Inside, the air is heavy, smoky, but survivable. This is what it meant when the wood ran out. It meant turning to every resource, every scrap, every clever trick. It meant refusing to let the cold win. So when you think of the Vikings, do not picture them only with axes raised or sails unfurled. Picture them here, in their longhouses, tending fires fed by peat, dung, and driftwood. Picture the smoke curling, the embers glowing, the children pressing close beneath hides. Picture the ingenuity that made survival possible, not just the battles that made legends. Because without these humble fuels, without the creativity to use what others might discard, there would have been no voyages, no raids, no sagas. There would have been silence, frozen in the dark. The Vikings remind us that survival is not about luxury. It is about adaptation. It is about seeing value where others see waste. When wood ran out, they did not surrender. They dug into bogs, gathered dung, combed beaches, and burned whatever the land or sea provided. They turned scarcity into strategy. They lived not because they had plenty, but because they had the will and wisdom to make use of everything. And in doing so, they taught a lesson that echoes across centuries. Survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. Picture the end of a Viking day when the light has gone from the sky and the longhouse glows only with the faint embers of the fire pit. The storm outside claws at the sod roof and the cold presses against every wall, seeping through cracks and sinking into the earth beneath the floor. The family has eaten what they could, broth thick with fat, porridge heavy with grains, maybe dried fish pulled from storage, and now it is time to sleep. But for the Vikings, sleep was not a time for comfort. It was a calculated act of survival, and the clothes on their backs became their last line of defense against the cold. They did not slip into soft nightclothes and fold themselves beneath cotton sheets. They dressed for bed the way modern explorers dress for the Arctic. They layered themselves in wool, fur, leather, and linen until their bodies became walking, breathing sleeping bags. Imagine watching a Viking family prepare for the night. The fire has been banked low, stones pulled from the coals to glow beneath furs. Children are bundled by their mothers in layer after layer, linen undergarments against the skin, rough but breathable, absorbing sweat and moisture. Over that, thick wool tunics trap pockets of warm air. Cloaks lined with fur add another shield, and heavy trousers cover legs from hip to ankle. Feet are wrapped in wool socks, sometimes stuffed with moss or straw for added insulation, crude but effective boots against the icy drafts creeping across the floor. Hoods pulled low cover ears and heads, because heat escapes fastest from the crown. By the time the family climbs into bed, they are not merely dressed, they are armored against the night. This system is something modern mountaineers call the onion method. Layer after layer, each trapping warmth and creating insulation. But the Vikings practiced it centuries before the name existed. They knew instinctively that a single heavy garment could not do the job. Wool alone could grow damp and heavy. Fur alone could leave gaps. But together, linen, wool, fur, and hide. They created a fortress around the body. Each layer trapped air, each layer added resilience, and each layer gave them another chance to wake alive in the morning. Think about the materials at their disposal. Wool was everywhere, spun from sheep that were themselves heaters inside the longhouse. Viking wool was coarse, heavy, and superbly warm. It held heat even when damp, a life-saving trait in a world of snow and ice. Over wool came cloaks and coats stitched from fur. Wolf pelts draped across shoulders, bear hides turned into heavy blankets, reindeer skins stitched into cloaks that shed both water and wind. For wealthier families, sealskin cloaks offered waterproof armor as close as they could come to the technology of modern Gore-Tex. Everything was practical, but everything was also symbolic. A cloak fastened with an ornate brooch was not just warmth, but identity, marking status even in the heart of winter. Now imagine lying down in bed fully dressed. Your cloak is wrapped around you, the brooch still pinned at your shoulder. Your boots are on, stuffed with straw. Your hood is pulled low, and your beard or hair tucks into the layers around your chest. Beside you, your children are wrapped in similar layers, and your spouse pulls a heavy reindeer hide across the group. A dog curls at your feet, its body adding one more layer of heat. Outside, the cold is merciless. Inside, you are transformed into a furnace of layered fabric and fur. Sleep comes not as comfort, but as strategy. Even accessories had survival value. Belts tightened cloaks close to the body, reducing drafts. Mittens stitched from animal hides kept hands from stiffening in the night. Some garments doubled as bedding, large cloaks spread over benches, then pulled around shoulders when it was time to lie down. Nothing was wasted, and everything had more than one purpose. Archaeological finds from Viking graves confirm this layering. Bodies were buried wrapped in multiple garments, wool tunics beneath cloaks, linen shirts beneath coats. The same strategies that preserved them in life accompanied them into death. The layering extended beyond clothes into bedding itself. Straw mattresses were covered with hides, furs, and woven blankets. Children were tucked between adults for maximum warmth. Families shared one large pile of coverings, not because they lacked space, but because every shared breath, every pressed body, added more heat. The clothes they wore to bed were only the first layer. The bedding was another, the family itself the final, most important. To undress for sleep, as we do today, would have been unthinkable. Nudity in a Viking longhouse was not vulnerability of modesty. It was vulnerability of death. To take off layers was to invite the cold inside, to let it creep into bones and steal life away. The only safe way to sleep was dressed, armored in every fabric available. Now think about the psychology of such a life. To us, dressing for bed is about comfort and softness, about separating day from night. For the Vikings, dressing for bed was about continuity. The day's clothes became the night's protection. The cloak worn to herd animals became the blanket at night. The boots worn in the snow stayed on, stuffed with insulation. Sleep was not a break from survival. It was a continuation of it, another battle fought with layers and ingenuity. The details matter. Wool trapped air and stayed warm when damp. Fur shed snow and added bulk. Linen absorbed sweat, preventing chills. Straw and moss added insulation for feet. Hoods and cloaks sealed gaps where heat could escape. Brooches and pins allowed quick fastening and unfastening, preventing gaps from forming. Even jewelry had function, doubling as survival gear in addition to decoration. To us, these might seem like small details. To the Vikings, they were the difference between shivering through a night and surviving one. Picture again the scene of the longhouse at night. The embers glow faintly, smoke lingers in the rafters, and the sod roof traps the heat inside. Along the benches, families lie in curtained pods, dressed in layer after layer, furs pulled tight. The air is heavy with the scent of wool, leather, and smoke. Beneath the bedding, hot stones glow with stored warmth. Beyond the curtains, animals shift in their stalls, their body heat rising, and in the middle of it all, the people sleep not as individuals, but as part of a living, layered system designed to defy the cold. Their clothes are their last defense, their wearable sleeping bags, their armor against the night. When you think of the Vikings, it is easy to imagine them on ships with sails full of wind, or on battlefields with axes raised. But their true endurance was here, in the nightly ritual of layering, of wrapping, of sealing themselves in fabric and fur. They survived not only through bravery, but through preparation, through the wisdom of knowing how to trap every ounce of warmth. Their strength was not just in the sword, but in the cloak, not only in the ship, but in the sock stuffed with straw. These were the choices that allowed them to endure winters longer than memory, to rise each morning and live another day. The lesson they leave us is clear. Survival is not always grand. It is often quiet, practical, and layered. The Vikings dressed for bed not because they sought comfort, but because they refused to yield to the cold. They wrapped themselves in wool, fur, linen, and hide until they became living furnaces, human sleeping bags that no blizzard could extinguish. And in that stubborn, clever ritual, they proved what history has always shown. Adaptability, more than strength, is what allows humanity to endure. To understand this, picture a Viking stepping out of the longhouse into a world where the air cuts like knives. He is not in a light tunic or bare-armed as the movies sometimes show. He is armored in layers. First, linen undergarments against the skin, soft enough to absorb sweat and prevent chills. Over that, thick wool tunics and trousers, coarse but warm, trapping air like natural insulation. Then comes the fur cloak, wolf or bear for the wealthy, sheepskin or goatskin for others, draped across shoulders and pinned at the chest with a brooch. The fur is not just thrown over the body, it is shaped, stitched, and fastened to seal in warmth while allowing movement. Boots are lined with straw, moss, or wool, sometimes covered in leather or sealskin to repel moisture. Hoods or caps made of fur protect ears and heads, and mittens stitched from reindeer hide keep fingers from freezing. Every piece of clothing is chosen for survival, but every piece also speaks to who that Viking is: wealth, trade connections, even family lineage. Wool was the backbone of Viking clothing. Sheep were everywhere in the north, and their wool was spun into thread, woven into fabric, and stitched into garments. Viking wool was not always soft. It was thick, coarse, and heavy, perfect for trapping heat. Dyes made from plants, lichens, and minerals colored the cloth in deep reds, yellows, blues, and greens. A wealthy woman might wear a dress dyed with imported indigo. A man might have stripes or checks woven into his tunic. But beneath the beauty was always the function: warmth. Wool held heat even when damp, making it indispensable in snow and ice. A Viking could walk through a blizzard, his cloak covered in snow, and still stay alive because of the layers beneath. Furs were the outer armor. Wolf, bear, reindeer, fox, and beaver all were prized for their insulating properties. Bear fur was thick and heavy, perfect for the coldest nights. Wolf pelts draped across shoulders were not just warm but intimidating, marking the wearer as strong and fierce. Reindeer hides, light yet insulating, were valued in trade and worn by those living closest to the Arctic. Seal skin and otter pelts were waterproof, keeping out the damp of sleet and melting snow. Each fur told a story of the land it came from, the hunt that brought it home, the family it would keep alive. To own such furs was not only to survive winter, but to display wealth, skill, and power. Accessories carried equal weight. Brooches, pins, and clasps held cloaks tight against drafts, preventing precious heat from leaking away. These fasteners were often made of bronze, silver, or even gold, decorated with intricate designs. They were not only practical but symbolic, marking status and artistry. A finely wrought brooch could tell others that this family had wealth, connections, or skillful craftsmen in their circle. Belts cinched layers close, holding cloaks against bodies, keeping warmth sealed in. Jewelry, too, was more than decoration. A silver arm ring could buy loyalty or food, but worn in winter, it might also secure a cloak tight enough to save a life. Fashion in the Viking world was never just vanity. It was a blend of identity and ingenuity. Imagine again the family preparing for bed inside the longhouse. No one strips down. Instead, they pull their cloaks tighter, fasten brooches securely, and crawl beneath hides still wearing layers. Children curl in wool tunics. Mothers keep their fur-lined cloaks wrapped even as they sleep, and fathers rest with belts still in place to hold their garments against their bodies. Their very clothing becomes bedding, their cloaks transforming into wearable sleeping bags. The fire pit glows faintly, but it does not need to blaze. The people are already sealed in their own armor of cloth and fur, radiating heat together beneath layers of garments designed to endure. And beyond survival, Viking fashion expressed pride. Even in the depths of winter, people decorated their garments with colorful trims, embroidery, and woven patterns. Cloaks might have tablet-woven borders in bright reds or yellows, standing out against dark wool. Women wore beaded necklaces over their dresses, sometimes shining with imported glass or amber, glowing in the firelight. Men wore tunics dyed with madder red or woad blue, colors that spoke of trade and wealth. Imagine a smoky hall filled with people, their clothes dark from smoke but bright with threads of color that told of journeys, battles, and pride. In a world where winter demanded constant endurance, these flashes of beauty were acts of defiance. To dress well in the cold was to show that you could endure it and still thrive. Archaeologists uncovering Viking graves often find garments preserved in soil, fragments of wool cloaks, pieces of fur, brooches and pins that once held layers tight. These artifacts speak louder than words. They tell us that fashion and survival were inseparable. The brooch at a woman's chest was both jewelry and shield. The boots on a man's feet were both status and insulation. The cloak across a child's shoulders was both identity and warmth. The Vikings lived in a world where beauty and necessity were the same thread woven together. Consider also how trade influenced fashion. Viking ships reached as far as the Middle East, and with them came silk, silver, and dyes. A wealthy chieftain's wife might wear imported silk bands sewn into her wool dress, not for warmth, but as a mark of status. A warrior might wear a cloak trimmed with exotic furs, showing he had connections far beyond his fjord. Yet beneath these luxuries lay the same practical base: wool, fur, linen, straw-stuffed boots. Survival always came first, but identity always followed. The Vikings never separated the two. Now picture the longhouse in midwinter. The fire is low, smoke lingers in the rafters, and the air smells of wool and leather. Families are wrapped in cloaks pinned with brooches, boots stuffed with moss, hoods pulled low. Children wear cloaks cut down from larger hides, stitched with care by mothers whose fingers worked in the dim light. Elders wear layers so thick they seem like mountains of fur and wool. Yet amid the smoke and the hardship, flashes of colour gleam, an embroidered trim here, a beaded necklace there, a polished brooch catching the light. Survival and pride sit side by side, woven together in every garment. The lesson is clear. For the Vikings, clothes were not only armour against the cold, but symbols of who they were. Every cloak, every fur, Every brooch carried weight. To be well dressed was to be alive, to show strength in the face of winter's cruelty. Their fashion was not frivolous. It was a declaration: we can endure, and we can endure beautifully. So when you think of the Vikings, do not imagine them half-dressed, bare-armed in the snow, swinging axes without cloaks. Imagine them as they truly were, layered in wool and fur, cloaks fastened with ornate brooches, boots stuffed with straw, hoods pulled tight, dressed not just to survive, but to thrive. Imagine their clothes glowing with firelight, their garments heavy with smoke and snow, their fashion as much a part of survival as their ships or swords. In the Viking world, fur and fashion were one and the same, and to wear them well was to conquer the cold with both strength and style. The Vikings understood something that modern nutritionists know well. Fat is energy. 1 gram of fat carries more than twice the calories of protein or carbohydrates. And calories mean heat. Whale blubber, seal fat, lard, butter, marrow, all were treasured, not because they tasted good by modern standards, but because they were heat stored in edible form. Imagine a Viking farmer spooning thick whale fat into a bowl of barley porridge, knowing that the slow digestion of that fat would keep his children warm for hours after the fire died low. It was not indulgence, it was strategy. Meals were deliberately heavy in the evening. By filling their stomachs with fat-rich food before bed, the Vikings turned their own bodies into furnaces. The digestion process itself generated heat, spreading warmth through muscle and bone. A bowl of greasy stew before bed could mean the difference between waking up alive or not waking at all. In this way, food became as much a weapon against the cold as furs or walls. Without it, the layers of hides and wool would be useless. A body starved of fuel cannot make heat. A body filled with fat-rich broth glows from within. Picture a family gathered in their pod-like bed after such a meal. The fire is little more than embers. Stones glow faintly beneath the hides. Animals breathe warmth from their stalls, and inside, bellies are full of broth heavy with fat. The warmth radiates outward, bodies digesting slowly, releasing energy into the smoky air. Outside, the storm rages, but inside, the family's own bodies are fires, smoldering long after the last flame has died. Even the foods they stored for winter reflected this strategy. Butter was buried in storage pits, sealed in barrels, kept underground to last through months of cold. Dried fish was oily and calorie-dense, preserved with salt and smoke. Fermented meats and cheeses carried fat and protein well into the leanest months. Every bite mattered, not just for strength, but for heat. The Vikings turned their food into insulation from the inside out. Whale blubber, when available, was the crown jewel of this system. Imagine thick slabs of white, greasy fat, unappetizing by modern standards. But to a Viking, it was pure energy. Melted into broth, chewed raw in chunks, or stored in barrels, it was the perfect survival food. A spoonful of blubber held more warmth than an entire loaf of bread. To eat it was to feed the inner fire that kept frostbite away. In Greenland, Iceland, and along the northern coasts, whale fat was life itself, carved from the sea and turned into nights endured. Bone broth was another weapon. Long simmering pots of bones released collagen and marrow, thickening the liquid into something rich and sustaining. It was like drinking warmth itself, liquid insulation that spread through the body. Hot broth at night was more than comfort. It was survival, coating stomachs with fat, filling veins with heat, pushing back the cold 1 spoonful at a time. Imagine sipping from a steaming bowl while snow piled against the door, the warmth flowing down into your core. The fire might be small, but the heat inside you blazed. Even the timing of meals reflected survival instincts. A large, fat-rich supper before bed ensured the body produced heat during the coldest hours of the night. Breakfast was lighter, often dried fish or porridge, enough to fuel morning chores. Midday meals were practical, whatever could be eaten quickly between work. But supper, that was the strategic meal, the moment when food transformed into fire. Families knew it instinctively. Go to bed on a full stomach and you wake up warm. Go to bed hungry and you might not wake up at all. Now think of the psychology. Eating fat-rich foods before sleep was not indulgence, but necessity. It was a way of saying, we will live another night. Children learned early that the greasy broth meant warmth, that chewing strips of blubber meant safety, that the heavy meal before bed was the invisible blanket that wrapped them in protection. To us, fat is something to avoid. To the Vikings, fat was life. This connection between food and survival extended into social life. Feasts where animals were slaughtered and broth flowed freely were not just celebrations. They were demonstrations of abundance, of a family's or chieftain's ability to endure winter. To feed people richly in the darkest months was to prove power and security. A full belly was more than comfort. It was a declaration of survival in a land where hunger and cold stalked every hall. Picture it once more, the longhouse at night, bellies full, bodies layered in wool and fur, cloaks drawn tight. Beneath the hides, warmth builds. Outside, the world is silent, frozen, unforgiving. Inside, life goes on, not because of roaring fires or endless wood, but because of the food carefully chosen, stored, and eaten with strategy. Every bite of fat, every sip of broth, every scrap of dried fish was another hour won against the night. The Vikings did not survive winter only with walls, roofs, and cloaks. They survived with diet, with the knowledge that food is heat, that fat is fire in disguise. They ate not for taste, but for endurance. They turned meals into weapons, transforming blubber, broth, and butter into warmth that no storm could steal. And in doing so, they left us a lesson as old as humanity. What you eat can keep you alive when the cold wants you dead. The silence of snowstorms brought gifts as well as threats. Thick drifts pressed against the sod walls, piling high until windows vanished and doors stuck shut. To the unprepared, this was a prison, but to the Vikings, it was insulation. Snow, though deadly outside, trapped heat when pressed against the house. A longhouse buried in drifts became warmer, sealed tighter, protected from drafts. The silence of the snowstorm was the silence of insulation wrapping itself around the home. Inside, the family could feel the difference. The air, though smoky, held its warmth better. The benches felt less exposed. The house became a cocoon, buried alive by the storm, but alive nonetheless. Yet the silence also carried fear. Heavy drifts could collapse roofs, smother livestock, and bury paths to food stores. The door might not open in the morning. A family might wake to find themselves sealed inside, forced to dig out with frozen hands. The stillness outside was deceptive. It was not safety. It was the pause between trials. After silence came hunger. After silence came the next storm. The Vikings understood this rhythm, living not in peace, but in cycles of noise and quiet, fury and calm, each as dangerous as the other. Inside, life adjusted to this silence. When storms buried the longhouse, families drew even closer. The fire was tended more carefully, each ember preserved like gold. Food was rationed, broth stretched with fat and grain, dried fish pulled from storage pits. Chores shrank to the inside world, weaving, carving, mending, storytelling. Outside was unreachable, dangerous, sealed in ice. Inside was everything. The longhouse became not just a home, but a womb, cut off from the world until the storm relented. Imagine lying in the smoky dark, listening not to the storm's howl, but to its absence, feeling the weight of snow pressing down, knowing the silence outside was both protection and prison. The Vikings did not fear this silence. They accepted it. They wove it into their sagas, their myths, their understanding of the world. The gods themselves lived in cycles of noise and quiet, war and waiting, fire and ice. The silence of snowstorms was part of that rhythm, a reminder that the earth was not passive but alive, shifting moods from fury to stillness. To live in the north was to live with silence as much as with storms. Archaeological evidence hints at how these winters shaped Viking life. Storage pits dug deep into the earth held dried food that could be accessed even when snow buried the ground. Hearths were designed to smolder for long hours, sustaining life through nights when no one dared step outside. Sleeping benches were built wide to hold entire families, because in the silence of snowstorms, survival meant staying inside together for days at a time. Everything about their architecture, their food, their clothing, reflected the need to endure not only the cold, but the stillness it brought. Think of the psychology of this silence. For us, silence can be restful, even peaceful. But for the Vikings, silence in winter was eerie. It meant the animals outside were hidden. It meant predators stalked quietly beneath the snow. It meant the landscape itself was smothered, waiting. In that silence, the only sound that mattered was the breath of the people around you. If you could hear them breathing in the dark, you knew you were not alone. You knew you were still alive. Now picture the morning after a night of such silence. The family stirs, embers are coaxed back into flame, and someone pushes against the door. It does not open. Snow has sealed it tight. The silence is still there, heavy, muffled, pressing. The family digs, pushing snow aside with hands and tools, breaking free into the cold. Outside, the world is transformed. The land is white, rolling, unbroken. The sounds of rivers and forests gone. Only the crunch of boots in snow breaks the silence. It is beautiful, yes, but it is also deadly. This is what it meant to live in the Viking North, to endure not just storms, but the silence they left behind. The Vikings teach us that silence can be as powerful as noise. The silence of snowstorms insulated their homes, buried their doors, and forced them into closeness. It tested their stores, their patience, their ingenuity. It was not a peace to be trusted. It was a reminder that nature rules with both fury and stillness, and survival depends on respecting both. Inside the smoky hall, pressed together under hides, they lived because they understood this. They knew the silence would pass, but only if they endured it wisely. So when you think of the Viking winter, do not imagine only the screaming wind or the raging storm. Imagine the silence after, when snow buried the world and the longhouse stood alone in a muffled white desert. Imagine the eerie quiet pressing on the ears, the warmth of shared breath in the smoky dark, the knowledge that outside was stillness deeper than sound. And imagine how they endured it, not with fear, but with preparation, patience, and the warmth of each other. The first task is the door. Snow has piled so high against it that pushing it open is nearly impossible. The man braces his shoulder, shoves hard, and only manages to open it a crack. A boy joins him, both pushing together until daylight bursts in, blinding against the white. The opening is narrow, the snow packed heavy, but it is enough. They take tools, wooden shovels, crude but sturdy, and begin to dig. The snow is heavy, the air sharp with cold, but step by step they carve a path. Behind them, the family waits, peering into the light, the longhouse at last opening back into the world. Outside, the land is unrecognizable. Fields, fences, even pathways are gone. Hills of snow cover everything, sculpted by wind into sharp ridges and strange curves. The silence is deep, broken only by the crunch of boots and the scraping of shovels. The fjord lies frozen, a sheet of white stretching to the horizon. It is beautiful, almost otherworldly, but it is also harsh. For the Vikings, dawn after a blizzard was not a time for awe. It was a time for action. Animals needed to be checked, roofs inspected, firewood or peat or dung collected before the next storm rolled in. The longhouse itself bore the scars of the night. The sod roof is heavy with snow, the beams creaking under the weight. Men climb up, careful, pulling snow aside with poles to keep the structure from collapsing. The walls, packed with earth, hold firm, but the doorway is a bottleneck, snow spilling inside as soon as it opens wide. Women spread straw across the floor again, covering damp patches, replacing what had grown sodden. Children are sent to fetch frozen water, to break ice from barrels, to carry feed to the animals. Life resumes, not gently, but with urgency. Food is another concern. The fat, rich meal from last night has burned through bodies, fueling the long sleep. Now hunger bites again, sharp and insistent. The cauldron is refilled, bones and scraps simmered into broth. Dried fish is pulled from storage pits, salted meat cut and boiled. The smell fills the hall, earthy and strong, a reminder that survival is not only about warmth, but also about steady fuel. Eating becomes the morning fire, filling bellies so bodies can move again, so the day's labor can begin. And yet, in the midst of all this work, there is relief. The storm has passed. The silence outside is no longer eerie, but almost calming. The longhouse has endured. The people have endured. The snow that pressed against the walls has also shielded them, insulating their home through the night. Now in daylight, that same snow sparkles like a jewel, reflecting the pale sun. Children play briefly in it, carving paths, laughing before they are called back to work. For a moment, the brutality of winter softens into beauty. But dawn after a blizzard is also a reminder. The cold has not gone, the storm will return. The Vikings knew that survival was not a single battle, but a season-long war. Each morning like this was a victory, but one that demanded preparation for the next fight. Paths must be dug not only to the door, but to storage pits, to barns, to latrines, to the shoreline. Supplies must be checked, fires carefully rationed, fuel preserved. Every action in the aftermath was part of the larger strategy of survival. Now picture the hall later in the day, after the digging is done and the animals fed. The benches are occupied again, the children chewing strips of dried fish, the adults speaking in low voices. Outside, the snow still lies thick, the silence broken only by the calls of crows circling overhead. The longhouse is smoky, warm compared to the air outside, and life goes on. In that moment, the family feels not only relief, but pride. They have survived another storm, another test. Their home has held, their strategies have worked, their closeness has carried them through. The sagas often tell of great battles, of raids and voyages across seas. But the truest battles were these, fought not with swords and shields, but with straw, hides, stones, and shared warmth. Dawn after a blizzard was the quiet victory, the unspoken triumph of endurance. It was not sung in poems or carved into runestones, but it was the foundation of every saga. Without mornings like these, without families who endured night after night, there would have been no ships built, no raids launched, no stories told. Survival in the longhouse made everything else possible. So when you imagine the Viking world, Do not stop at the image of warriors charging across the sea. Picture instead the quiet dawn after a storm, when families emerged from their smoky halls into a white, silent landscape. Picture them digging paths, tending animals, boiling broth, and pulling snow from roofs. Picture them standing in the crisp air, breath rising in clouds, looking out at a world buried in silence and knowing they had won another night. For the Vikings, that was victory. That was survival.